From MLW Court, did you get a chance to see the Andre the Giant special? What did you think?
I did. It was really cool. They had a historian, Pat Leprot, and he did a great job of just giving little anecdotes, stuff I didn't know about Andre. I knew a lot about Andre, which says a lot about my spare time, but I knew a lot about Andre, but there was stuff still I did not know. And I thought we hear some of the people that were around him at his compound in North Carolina, you get a sense for a different side of Andre, which I thought was fascinating. The archival footage was great. Tim White, he's phenomenal. And you could see the footage where they showed Andre playing cards with Dusty Rhodes backstage and he gets hot.
Yeah.
Dude, that was great. I loved it. I really did. There's always going to be people say, well, there were certain things that maybe a bit were embellished, not knowing the finish of WrestleMania 3. Come on, man. We all knew the finish going into that one. But it was still, that's just kind of how it's going to be romanticized, which is okay. But he was seriously one of the most fascinating characters to ever be in the business. Did you ever get to be around Andre much?
Man, I remember it was probably – it had to have been 92 or 93. We're at a television taping in Center Stage. It's got to be around that time frame. And this was when Andre was on crutches. And I remember in the documentary they showed him on those crutches. He was on those things when he was walking across Center Stage. And there he was. And I was a WCW guy. I had just come from USWA. Before that, I was in Dallas. Andre had been all around the world for, at that point for probably 30 years. And he was on that downhill, descent that he was kind of going through physically. And man, I was a nobody, dude. I was Steve Austin, or I guess I was stunning Steve Austin because I was in WCW. But, compared to Andre, man, I was a J-Bron. But I knew that I had to introduce myself to Andre. He didn't know who the hell I was. But out of all the stories that I'd ever heard and all the matches that I'd seen of him and the legend of Andre, dude, that's one of those things where you just got to go shake his hand. Very intimidating guy. Especially because I was young in the business and this guy was such a legend, and obviously Andre the Giant. So, man, I walked up to him and I said, hey, Andre, I said, my name's Steve Austin. I said, I just wanted to shake your hand and say nice to meet you. So, dude, I introduced myself to him. I met the man in person, and that's all I got. But, dude, I just had to because I had to pay my respects because I call him the eighth wonder of the world, and people always talk about these bullshit Mount Rushmore things and stuff like that. But Andre, just like Vince said, Andre was an attraction. And, in his younger days, I mean, dude, he could do some scientific, a little bit of technical wrestling. He kind of slowed down, as he turned into, really the Giant after he went through all the name changes. And then Vince got a hold of him. And, dude, he did his basic formula. If he didn't like you, he was going to toss you around the ring, torture you. Like, I'd heard that he wasn't real fond of Jake the Snake Roberts, and they would be in a tag match. Rick Rude and Jake would be teaming up against Andre and somebody, or maybe it was a handicap match. And Andre would just stand on Jake's hair and just surfboard him and pull his arms back. Do stuff like that. But, and then, like Jake would just be looking at Rude, and Rude would be over laughing his ass off because he knew what the deal was, just wanting to tag out. But, dude, he was an attraction. It was interesting to hear Vince talk about, and that's why Vince has always been so smart. Like he knew it was an attraction. He wasn't, a guy that was going to work a different match, with another guy. He was going to work the Andre the Giant match. And so, man, he loaned him out to all the damn different promotions, kept everybody happy, and he kept Andre fresh. And, dude, that's, when you think about it, you had to protect Andre. And that was, you had to protect him. You did. But it was really interesting how he was basically always kept out of the world title picture.
Yeah, that's something that's interesting, too. He was part of the focus in WrestleMania 3 and then 4. But earlier on when he was able to do more, they kept him away from the title. What's interesting, too, with the recent passing of Bruno Sammartino, who was a huge folk hero here, at least in the Northeast, there was talk about, I guess, Bruno and Andre wanted to do a match, and Vince Sr. said, no, never. They'll never get that match. Vince Sr. would give Bruno just about anything, the same for Andre, but that was one match he was not going to do. He did not want to put two of his top baby faces against each other because what's the finish? That's what Vince Jr. would always say is, okay, that sounds great, but what's the finish? And we'd all sit there scratching our heads. Well, shit, just sounded good on paper.
And dude, that's, when you think about it, you had to protect Andre, and that was, you had to protect him. You did. But it was really interesting how he was basically always kept out of the world title picture.
Yeah, that's something that was interesting too. I mean, he was part of the focus in WrestleMania 3 and then 4. But earlier on, when he was able to do more, they kept him away from the title. What's interesting too, with the recent passing of Bruno Sammartino, who was a huge folk hero here, at least in the Northeast, there was talk about, I guess, Bruno and Andre wanted to do a match, and Vince Sr. said no, never. They'll never get that match. Vince Sr. would give Bruno just about anything, the same for Andre, but that was one match he was not going to do. He did not want to put two of his top baby faces against each other, because what's the finish? That's what Vince Jr. would always say is, okay, that sounds great, but what's the finish? And we'd all sit there scratching our heads. Well, shit, just sounded good on paper. Boss, we figured you'd get that part of it.
Man, that's interesting that you say that, because, what do you do? And would it hurt either guy?
Yeah, it's a weird time too, because in the say the late 70s, when they did the Shea Stadium show or something like that, it certainly would have popped business, I think. But then you got to remember, back then in the territory days, they didn't do baby faces against each other because it didn't pop business. Very rarely. If you think about the old WWF versus NWA title matches, it was like Harley Race versus Bob Backlund. That was heel versus babyface. It wasn't, Dusty versus Backlund or something like that. It was Dusty as the NWA champion versus the WWF champion superstar Billy Graham, babyface heel. So there was a lot behind that. I mean, even I remember Gary Hart telling me, babyface matches sound good and they might draw, but when the bell rings, it doesn't get the reaction you think it will. And it's true. Most of those babyface matches, it's like crowds don't know what to do with it. Sometimes they'll turn on one guy, and it's not the guy by design you want them to turn on. It's Russian roulette. And for a promoter, that's dangerous when you have such immense attractions like Bruno and Andre, because you didn't want to beat Andre, and you know that Bruno didn't lose too often. But Bruno was down to do business, yet Vince Sr. still was not going to do that match, which that's one of those great dream matches, at least for us in the Northeast. I think that would have been pretty cool. Both way before my time, but Bruno's presence was felt for decades beyond his time in the ring, which speaks to his contributions in the ring, because he helped build the WWF and WWF.
Man, with the passing of Bruno Sammartino, all of a sudden I started getting some notifications on Twitter, and I think my wife said some famous wrestler just died. And I was like, Jesus Christ, another guy, OD'd or whatever. But it wasn't. It was Bruno. It was, what was he, about 80?
82.
82. Obviously lived a long life, and obviously was an absolute legend in the business of professional wrestling and a super draw. But, dude, he was a little before my time, and that was, everything was a lot more regional back then. So I didn't get a whole lot of Bruno. But I understand the legend that is Bruno Sammartino and the money that he drew. Did you ever get a chance to see any of his work, or have you checked it out on YouTube? You're a little bit younger than me. But how familiar are you with his work? Because, you're up there in that area. I think, he's from Pittsburgh or wherever he's from.
Yeah.
But just, the Italians and everybody just absolutely love the guy. And I don't know how many times he sold at Madison Square Garden, but an absolute legend. But I just didn't know a whole lot about his work.
And you got to remember when he was on top and in the Garden too, which was a monthly thing. This is the 60s, mid 60s into throughout the 70s, but really for the early part of his run, the first third of it, you got to remember what the sports world was like here in New York. This was post Mickey Mantle era Yankees, which no one talks about for a reason. The New York Mets, had some promise, but were still really in their infancy. The Jets had that Joe Namath run, but beyond that, there wasn't much going on in football, and the Knicks didn't heat up until the early 70s, really. So he really was the guy in this town who drew very well. And you look at how New York has always been such a melting pot, but especially then whenever, you had Arthur Avenue was super Italian, you had Little Italy, but everywhere, even in the suburbs, the tri-state area here in New York,